The 14th of January, 1946. US Naval Base, Guam. The sound came first. The crunch of heavy boots on the coral pathway, sharp in the pre-dawn chill. Chio instinctively pulled Akiko closer, shielding the younger nurse's trembling shoulders with her own body. The smells of lye soap and damp canvas still clung to them from the laundry lines. They stood in formation, just as they had been taught in Osaka, but everything else was wrong. A painted sign near the mess tent door read, "Maintain orderly line. Await instructions." Lieutenant Davis, the head nurse whose sternness seemed at odds with her meticulous care, approached the front of the formation. The Japanese women tensed. Akiko whispered, "Are they taking us somewhere else? To a different camp?" Chio shook her head, though her own heart hammered. She could feel the strange, rigid structure beneath her uniform. The American brassiere, still feeling foreign against her skin even after weeks. It was a constant, engineered reminder of their surrender, and of the impossibly complex nation that had captured them. "It's just roll call, ladies," Lieutenant Davis announced, her voice cutting the tension. "Stand easy." Chio watched the American nurse tick names off a clipboard. This ritual felt almost normal, yet it was the most abnormal moment of her life. We are documenting these lesser-known histories from all perspectives. Subscribe to see more archival stories and share which country you are watching from. This strange new life, defined by confusing rituals and objects, had begun weeks ago, in a haze of terror and disbelief. 6 weeks earlier. Processing Center, Peleliu. Processing Center, Peleliu Island. Late 1944. Chio tasted ash. It was on her tongue, in her hair, and coating the raw scrape on her elbow. She did not know how long they had been marching, only that the sun had moved from one side of the sky to the other. The jungle had given way to a landscape of churned coral and shattered palms, and finally, to this place of wire and canvas. "Move! Move it!" The American words were harsh bursts of sound, meaningless as grenade concussions. Yet the intent was clear. A Marine, impossibly tall and sunburned, shoved the air behind them with his rifle. Akiko stumbled on the uneven ground, her small whimper lost in the noise of generators and shouting men. Chio grabbed the younger nurse's arm, pulling her upright. "Keep walking." Chio murmured in Japanese, her voice a dry rasp. "Do not look at them. Do not fall." They were the last. The surviving doctors had been separated hours ago. Now it was just them, 7 nurses and civilian aides, herded like livestock into a roped-off square of dirt. Radio Tokyo's final broadcasts had been clear. They knew what the Americans did to prisoners. They knew what the devils of the Pacific did to women. Chio's mind flashed to the small grenade she had failed to use, the one she was supposed to detonate against her chest rather than face this. Her failure to die honorably had led her here. Inside, now, a guard pointed to a long, low structure, made of corrugated tin and raw lumber. It looked temporary, brutal. A foul, chemical odor billowed from its open doorway, sharp, stinging, like the lye soap used for scrubbing surgical floors, but magnified 100 times. This was it. The medical tent the propaganda had warned them about. The place of violation. Chio's legs locked. Akiko began to tremble violently, her teeth chattering. "Chio-san," she whispered. "I am scared. They are going to—" "Silence," Chio commanded, though her own stomach was hollow with terror. She positioned her body slightly in front of Akiko's, a useless, instinctive gesture of protection. They were pushed through the doorway and into a sudden, humid darkness. The smell was overwhelming. It burned her nostrils. The floor was not dirt, but cold, wet concrete. A single, caged bulb hanging from a rafter cast weak yellow light over a row of shower heads protruding from a rusted pipe. "Halt! Line up!" They huddled together, 7 women reduced to shivering animals, blinking as their eyes adjusted. The concrete was slick beneath their torn tabi socks. They were trapped. Chio scanned the walls for an escape, for a weapon, but there was only bare tin and the steady drip, 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 of a leaky fixture. The air was thick with the chemical sting of DDT and caustic soda. Akiko choked back a sob. This is where we die. Chiyo braced herself. She thought of her mother in Osaka, of the crisp smell of pine at the shrine near her home. She would not scream. She would show them nothing. The heavy wooden door at the far end of the room scraped open. The sound was deafening in the small space. The women flinched as one. Chiyo stared, her entire body tensing for the final, brutal assault. But the figures who entered were not the massive, bearded Marines who had captured them. They were women. They were tall, pale women dressed in immaculate olive-drab uniforms. Their skirts were pressed. Their hair was pinned neatly under garrison caps. They moved with a clinical, detached efficiency, carrying metal trays, bars of dark soap, and shears. One, a lieutenant with sharp blue eyes and hair the color of straw, pinned a clipboard to the wall. These were the enemy nurses. The Japanese women stared, paralyzed by this cognitive dissonance. The radio had never mentioned these. The lieutenant, her name tag reading Davis's, looked at the huddled prisoners not with malice, but with a weary impatience, as if they were a particularly difficult stain to remove. She barked an order to one of her subordinates, who began checking the shower heads. Lieutenant Davis then turned to the prisoners. She made a sharp, downward motion with her hands. Clothes. Off. All of it. No one moved. They did not understand the words, but the gesture was universal. Akiko. No. Chiyo whispered, pulling the girl back. This was the humiliation. The prelude. The lieutenant sighed, exasperated. She stepped forward, not toward Chiyo, but toward the oldest woman in the group, a civilian aide. The nurse did not strike her. She simply, and firmly, began unbuttoning the woman's torn blouse. The woman shrieked and slapped her hands away. Lieutenant Davis stepped back, her face hardening. She spoke again, slow and loud, as if to children. You are dirty. You have lice. You will be cleaned. She pointed to the showers, then to the bars of soap. One of the other American nurses, younger and with dark hair, offered a small, hesitant smile. She held up a bar of soap. Soap, she said, pointing to it. Wash. Is okay. The tension in the room shifted. The terror of imminent death did not disappear, but it was complicated now by a profound, disorienting confusion. These women were not here for violation. They were here to work. Akiko looked at Chiyo, her eyes wide with questions Chiyo could not answer. Lieutenant Davis nodded, satisfied that the impasse was broken. She pointed to their ragged, filthy uniforms on the floor. All. Off. Now, slowly, feeling the eyes of the American nurses on them, Chiyo and the others began to undress, their movements stiff with shame and cold. They stripped away the last remnants of their former lives, the blood-caked uniforms of the Imperial Army Medical Corps, and stood naked on the cold concrete. They were ordered under the showers. The water was shockingly hot, scalding, and smelled of the same caustic chemicals. But it was water. It was cleaning them. Chiyo scrubbed her skin until it was raw, the chemical soap burning the small cuts on her arms. She kept her eyes shut, trying to dissociate from the clinical hands of an American nurse who inspected her scalp for lice, the metal teeth of the comb dragging across her skin. It was methodical. It was impersonal. It was not the brutality she had expected. It was something else entirely. Something bureaucratic and sterile, which, in its own way, was just as terrifying. The water shut off with a final, violent shudder of the pipes. Steam, thick with the smell of lye, filled the concrete lawn. It clung to their skin, making the sudden chill of the air feel even colder. The 7 Japanese women were ordered to line up against the far wall, their bodies still dripping, their feet numb on the wet concrete. Chiyo stood rigid, staring at a water stain on the tin opposite her. She could feel Akiko trembling beside her, trying to make herself small, to cover herself with her own arms. Chiyo resisted the urge. She would not give them the satisfaction of her shame. She kept her chin up, her gaze fixed, channeling the discipline of her nursing training Even in this moment of ultimate degradation, Lieutenant Davis, the formidable American nurse, moved down the line. She was no longer the angel of mercy Chio had briefly, foolishly, imagined when she first entered. She was an inspector. Her sharp blue eyes scanned every inch of them. She barked a word at one of her subordinates, who handed her a wooden tongue depressor. Davis stopped in front of the oldest woman. "Open." The woman stared blankly. Davis tapped the woman's chin with the stick, then impatiently pushed her jaw down, shining a small flashlight into her mouth. She checked her teeth, her gums. She moved to the next woman, lifting her arms to inspect her armpits, then gesturing for her to turn around, examining her back for rashes or sores. It was methodical, detached, and utterly humiliating. Chio's mind raced. What was this? The propaganda had spoken of rape and torture, of monstrous experiments. But this was something else. It was cold. It was agricultural. They were being inspected like cattle before an auction, their health and viability assessed. Were they being sorted, graded for different kinds of labor, or worse? The lieutenant reached Akiko. The girl flinched violently, letting out a small, terrified sound. Davis paused, her gaze lingering on the girl's trembling form. Chio tensed, ready to spring forward. Though she knew it was hopeless, Davis simply reached out and tilted Akiko's chin up toward the light. She examined the girl's scalp, her movements firm but not violent, then ran a gloved finger along her collarbone, assessing her malnourished state. She jotted a note on the clipboard hanging from a wall hook. Then, she was in front of Chio. Chio met the lieutenant's blue-eyed gaze. She refused to look away. She felt the American's clinical stare travel over her, noting the scar on her shoulder from a shrapnel fragment, the bruises on her legs from the march. The lieutenant's expression was unreadable, a mask of professional neutrality. Chio braced herself for the touch, for the cold intrusion of the gloved hand or the wooden stick. Lieutenant Davis held her gaze for a beat longer. Then, she turned to the metal tray held by the younger, dark-haired nurse. Chio expected a syringe, perhaps, or some marking instrument. Instead, the lieutenant picked up a small, coiled object. With a flick of her wrist, it unspooled. It was a long, narrow ribbon of bright yellow cloth, marked with black lines and numbers that Chio could not read. A tape measure. Chio's brain stuttered. She stared at the object, completely unable to process its purpose. A measure? Why would they measure them? Was it for a uniform? A coffin? The absurdity of the thought made her feel lightheaded. Lieutenant Davis stepped closer. She did not ask for permission. She raised the tape measure and, with an efficiency that was almost insulting, wrapped it around the oldest woman's ribcage, just beneath her bust. The woman gasped, shrinking away. "Hold still," Davis commanded, her voice flat. She read the number, said it aloud to the other nurse. 34, who wrote it down next to the woman's name, which she'd presumably been assigned. She moved to the next woman, wrapped the tape. 36. And the next. 32. Chio watched, mesmerized by the simple, baffling ritual. The soft zip of the tape being pulled. The clipped sound of the American numbers. The scratch of the pencil on the clipboard. The terror that had been a cold stone in her stomach began to dissolve, replaced by a profound, dizzying confusion. The devils were not branding them. They were not violating them with instruments of torture. They were fitting them. The lieutenant reached Chio. Before Chio could react, the tape measure was around her. It was cool against her damp skin, smelling faintly of vinyl and dust. The nurse pulled it snug. 34, Davis called out, already moving to Akiko. Chio let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her entire body felt weak. She looked down at her own skin, half expecting to see a mark where the yellow ribbon had been. There was nothing. Akiko, too, was measured. 32, her small frame barely registering. When it was done, the 7 women stood in silence, breathing in the last of the chemical steam. The ritual was over. They had been inspected, deloused, and now, measured. Lieutenant Davis hung the tape measure back on the tray and made a final notation on her clipboard. She tore the sheet off and handed it to the younger nurse. "Get the supplies," she ordered. The younger nurse nodded and hurried out of the lawn, leaving them alone once more with the lieutenant. Chio watched the door close. Her mind was a blank. She had prepared for death, for brutality, for an honorable end. She had not prepared for this. She had not prepared for the calculated, baffling, and impersonal bureaucracy of American-style cleansing. She had not prepared for the tape measure. The door clicked shut, leaving them in the echoing silence of the LAN. The younger nurse was gone. Lieutenant Davis remained, standing near the doorway as if on guard. She made no move toward them, busying herself with her clipboard, her pen scratching loudly in the quiet. The 7 women stood, naked and shivering. The immediate threat of death had passed, but it left a vacuum. Chio's mind, trained for medical emergencies, tried to find a pattern, a protocol. There was none. This was not war as she knew it. It was not capture as she had been taught. The violence was not of the body, but of logic. Akiko let out a small, shuddering sigh. Chio reached out and squeezed her arm, a silent command to remain strong. They waited. The only sounds were the drip, drip, drip of the faulty shower head and the scratch of the lieutenant's pen. They were cold. The lye soap had left their skin feeling tight and painfully clean. Chio could feel the goosebumps rise on her arms. How long would they stand here? The door scraped open again. The younger, dark-haired nurse returned. She was carrying a simple wooden crate. Lieutenant Davis nodded toward them, and the nurse approached the line, her expression neutral, perhaps a little weary. She stopped at the first woman and handed her 3 items from the crate. A small, thin towel of a rough, brownish material. A pair of simple, white cotton panties. And a third item, also white, folded into a small, strange square. The woman took them with trembling hands, clutching them to her chest. The nurse moved to the next woman, and the next. Each received the same allotment. Then, she was in front of Chio. Chio kept her eyes lowered, accepting the items as they were offered. The towel was coarse, but it was dry. The panties were simple, recognizable. Then the nurse handed her the third object. Chio's fingers closed around it. It was heavier than she expected, stiffer. She looked down at the thing in her hand. It was not a sarashi. The sarashi she had worn her entire adult life was a single, long, immaculate strip of white cloth. It was simple. It was pure. Its purpose was to bind, to flatten, to secure, to make the body modest and uniform. This was something else. Chio unfolded it. The object revealed a complex architecture that baffled her. It was a harness of fabric and straps. 2 distinct, cone-shaped cups were sewn into a band, reinforced with intricate stitching she had only ever seen on parachutes. Attached were 2 long, thin straps, made of a strange, rubbery material, woven into the cotton they stretched when she pulled them. Akiko, beside her, let out a tiny gasp. She was holding hers up, examining it with the same bewildered terror. Chio turned the object over in her hands. On the back of the band, she found a row of tiny, silver-colored metal hooks, and opposite them, 3 neat rows of metal eyes. Metal, on underwear. She ran her thumb over the cool, smooth hook. She felt the stiff seam of the cup, designed not to flatten, but to hold, to shape. It was not a piece of cloth. It was a machine. A profound, cultural vertigo seized her. This was not clothing as she understood it. This was an item of engineering. She looked from the object to Lieutenant Davis, who was now instructing them, with impatient gestures, to dry themselves and get dressed. The women fumbled with the towels, quickly drying their bodies, desperate to be covered again. They pulled on the clean cotton panties. The fit was loose, but the fabric was clean. It was a small, profound comfort. Then, they were left with the object. Chio looked at it. She looked at Akiko, who was trying to wrap it around her torso like a sarashi, the straps dangling uselessly. The oldest woman was attempting to tie the straps around her neck. Chio saw the hooks. She saw the eyes. She understood, in a sudden, sickening flash of insight, how it was meant to function. It was a fastener. Her fingers, trained for the precise work of sutures and bandages, fumbled with the alien mechanism. She wrapped the band around her torso, beneath her breasts, and tried to join the hooks and eyes behind her back. Her cold fingers slipped. She could not do it. Shame burned her face. She was a nurse, a soldier of the Emperor, and she was defeated by a piece of American underwear. She tried again, this time bringing the object to her front. She hooked it, feeling the small, satisfying click as the metal secured. Then, she rotated the entire contraption around her body and slipped her arms through the elastic straps. She pulled the straps onto her shoulders. The effect was instantaneous. The harness settled against her skin. The cups, which had seemed so bizarre, lifted and held her. It was not the tight, restrictive binding of her sarashi. It was support. It was structure. She felt, absurdly, armored. She looked down. Beneath her skin, she could feel the rigid construction, the stretch of the elastic, the cold security of the metal hooks. This, she realized, was a brassiere. She had seen drawings of them in smuggled Western magazines that had been denounced as decadent and corrupt, and the enemy had just given them to her. She looked at the other women, now slowly figuring out the mechanics, their faces a mask of confusion. Why? Her mind raced. Why this? Why not a simple strip of cloth, like the bandages they used? It would have been cheaper, simpler. Why provide prisoners of war with such a complex, specialized, modern garment? A garment that used metal and elastic materials vital for the war effort. This was not the act of a brutal, desperate enemy. This was the act of an enemy with so much excess, so much industrial power, that they could afford to waste complex manufactured goods on women they had just captured. It was not an act of kindness. It was, she thought, the most terrifying demonstration of power she had ever witnessed. The young, dark-haired nurse returned, this time carrying a stack of neatly folded, dark green clothing. She placed the stack on the wooden crate and began handing a set to each woman. Chio received hers. The material was thick, heavy, and stiff with what smelled like new dye and factory sizing. It was a pair of trousers and a loose-fitting jacket, both made of a distinctively patterned herringbone twill. She recognized it instantly. This was the fatigue uniform of the American soldiers. The order was given with a simple gesture. Put these on. Chio pulled the trousers on. They were ridiculously large, designed for a man's frame. And she had to cinch the waist tightly, folding the excess material over itself. Then came the jacket. As she slipped her arms through, the stiff fabric scraped against her skin, which was still tender from the lye soap. But the strangest sensation came from within. Beneath the rough, utilitarian canvas of the HBT uniform, she could feel the complex, separate architecture of the brassiere. The contrast was profound. The uniform was a shapeless sack, designed to erase her form, to designate her as prisoner. But the garment beneath it was designed for the precise opposite. It asserted her form. The brassiere felt like a cage of wires and elastic, holding her in a way that was completely foreign. Her sarashi had been about compression, a uniform pressure that was part of her discipline. This American device was about separation and lift. It was a constant, structural reminder of the civilization that had produced it. She felt the elastic straps digging slightly into her shoulders and the band constricting her ribs. It was not comfortable. It was a harness, a piece of equipment she had been forced to wear. And yet, she looked at Akiko. The girl was swimming in the olive-drab fatigues. The trousers pooled around her ankles, and the sleeves of the jacket hung past her fingertips. She looked like a child playing dress-up in her father's clothes, a pathetic, defeated figure. But then Chio's eyes adjusted. She looked closer. Despite the humiliating uniform, Akiko was standing differently. Her shoulders, though still slumped, were not caved in. The brassiere beneath the baggy shirt gave her a structure that Chio had not seen in months. The girl was no longer a half-starved, bedraggled waif. The clean lines of the garment, invisible though they were, imposed a strange, small measure of dignity. It forced her to stand, physically, more like a woman, and less like a refugee. It was this contradiction that held Chio captive. The Americans had stripped them, scrubbed them like animals, and dressed them in the shapeless clothing of their own soldiers. It was an act of erasure. Yet, in the same breath, they had issued this intimate, complex, and undeniably feminine object. They were simultaneously erasing their identity as Japanese nurses and reinforcing their identity as women. Outside. Move. Lieutenant Davis's voice cut through her thoughts. The door to the outside world, to the camp, was opened. Sunlight flooded the lawn, blinding them. After the humid dimness of the concrete bunker, the bright, tropical light was a physical blow. Chio raised a hand to shield her eyes, the stiff HBT sleeve scratching her forehead. They were marched out onto a pathway of crushed white coral that crunched loudly under their new, ill-fitting canvas boots. The camp was a sea of olive-drab tents and wooden structures, meticulously organized in straight lines. It was loud. Men shouted in English, jeeps rumbled past, and somewhere in the distance, a radio played jaunty, brass-filled music that sounded chaotic to her ears. Chio kept her eyes fixed on the back of the woman in front of her. She was acutely aware of the American soldiers they passed, Marines leaning against jeeps or digging ditches. Their faces were hard. Some stared with open curiosity, others with a flat, chilling hatred. This was the enemy. She felt the brassiere shift against her skin. It was a foreign object, a marker of her captivity. As surely as the PW she assumed would soon be stenciled on the back of her new uniform, they were led to a long, low barracks, much like the others, built of raw pine. The air smelled of fresh-cut wood, canvas, and the nearby latrine. Lieutenant Davis stopped them at the door. She spoke to a new guard, handing him the clipboard. The guard, an older man with tired eyes, unlocked the door. Davis turned to them one last time. Her face was still a mask of clinical efficiency. "You will remain here. Food will be brought. Do not," she pointed, "leave the building." She left. The door was closed, and Chio heard the unmistakable, heavy sound of a bolt sliding shut. They were alone. The barracks was dark, containing only 8 steel cots, each with a thin mattress and a single, folded blanket. Akiko immediately sat on the nearest cot, her small body seeming to collapse. She looked down at her hands, lost. Chio remained standing, the strange, buoyant music from the radio faintly audible through the walls. She stood in the center of the room, trapped in a dead man's uniform, her body held captive by an American-engineered harness. She felt the structured cups, the elastic bands, the metal hooks. It was the most intimate and most powerful invasion she had yet experienced. The first 3 days in the barracks were a blur of humid silence. A new routine, stark and simple, established itself. Twice a day, the heavy bolt would slide back. The tired-eyed older guard would push a crate inside containing K rations, tins of processed meat, and a large canteen of chlorinated water. He never spoke. He never looked at them. He simply delivered the supplies and locked the door. The 7 women established their own territory on the steel cots. They spoke little, their shared trauma still too raw, their futures too terrifyingly blank. Chio's world shrank to the smell of raw pine, mildew, and the metallic tang of the canned food. Her only constant physical reminder of the outside world was the brassiere. It was a torment. In the damp, oppressive heat of the barracks, the elastic straps felt sticky, the cotton cups never fully dried, and the metal hooks sometimes dug into her back when she tried to sleep. It was a foreign harness, a piece of American equipment she could not remove. Akiko had cried quietly the first night, complaining that it chafed her skin. Chio, displaying the authority of her former rank, had ordered her to endure it. It was part of the uniform now. On the 4th morning, the bolt slid back, but the sound was different, sharper, more aggressive. It was not the old guard. This Marine was young, barely 20. His uniform was crisp, but his eyes were not tired. They were bright with a cold, frantic energy. He did not set the crate down. He kicked it, sending it scraping across the wooden floor, spilling a can of water. "Get it," he spat. The women froze. This was different. This was the face from the propaganda. This was the devil they had been warned about. Akiko, closest to the door, flinched back as if struck. The Marine laughed, a short, ugly sound. He lingered at the doorway, staring at them. His gaze was not clinical, like Lieutenant Davis's. It was filled with a deep, personal hatred. Animals, he whispered, loud enough for them to hear the venom, even if they did not know the word. Chiyo met his gaze, her heart hammering. She pulled Akiko behind her. The Marine sneered. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a crumpled, greasy piece of newspaper. He balled it up and threw it into the center of the room. It landed near Chiyo's feet. "Figured you'd want to read the news, Japs," he said. He slammed the door. The bolt rammed home. Silence descended. Akiko was shaking. Chiyo waited a full minute before moving. Then, slowly, she bent down and picked up the wadded paper. She smoothed it out on her cot. It was a copy of the Stars and Stripes, the American military newspaper. Most of it was meaningless text she could not decipher. But she did not need to. At the center of the page was a large political cartoon. It depicted a caricature of a Japanese soldier, not a soldier, a monster. He had huge buck-toothed fangs, thick glasses, and was crawling on the ground like an ape, holding a bloody knife. The headline above it contained the one word she recognized, Japs. Chiyo stared at the image. A cold dread, familiar and confirming, settled over her. This was what they truly thought of her, of Akiko, of them all. They were not women, not nurses. They were animals in a cage. The clinical efficiency of the delousing lawn, the measuring tape, the careful distribution of the brassiere, it was all a lie, a facade. This piece of paper, thrown in contempt, was the truth. The young Marine was the true face of America. She felt the damp, structured cups of the brassiere clinging to her skin. The sensation was suddenly, violently disgusting. It was a lie, a piece of enemy equipment designed to mock her, to dress her up like a doll while they saw her as a beast. She was still staring at the cartoon when the bolt scraped back again, hours later. It was the young Marine, returning for the empty crate, but he was not alone. Lieutenant Davis stood behind him, her arms crossed, holding her clipboard. She had apparently arrived for an inspection. The Marine swaggered into the room to grab the crate, but Davis stopped him. Her eyes had locked onto the crumpled newspaper on Chiyo's cot. She looked at Chiyo. She looked at the cartoon. Then she looked at the Marine. Her face, normally a mask of neutrality, was now glacial. "What is this, Marine?" Her voice was low, cutting. The Marine, caught off guard, stammered. It's just a paper, ma'am. From the mess. And what is it doing in here?" "Just giving the prisoners something to read, ma'am." He tried a conspiratorial smile. "Keep 'em occupied." Lieutenant Davis took one step closer to him. She was shorter than him, but she seemed to tower over him. "Protocol dictates non-fraternization, Marine. That does not mean be cruel. It means do not interact. It certainly does not mean you distribute your personal filth and propaganda." The Marine's smile vanished. His face flushed red. "Ma'am, they are prisoners of war," Davis interrupted, her voice like ice. "They are under the protection of the Articles of the Geneva Convention, which my corps is tasked with upholding. They are not animals. They are prisoners, and you will not antagonize them. You will not throw things at them. You will do your job, which is to deliver their rations and secure the building. Is that clear?" The young man was speechless. He was being dressed down, ferociously, by a nurse. "I asked you," Davis said, her voice dropping even lower. "If that was clear." "Yes, ma'am," he ground out. "Good. Now pick it up." The Marine stared at her. "Ma'am, pick it up," she ordered. Seething, his entire body rigid with humiliation, the Marine stalked over to Chiyo's cot. He snatched the newspaper, crushing it in his fist. "Now get out," Davis said. He hauled the crate and stormed out of the barracks. Lieutenant Davis watched him go. She made a sharp notation on her clipboard. Without giving Chiyo or the other women a single glance, she turned and followed him, pulling the door shut. The bolt, handled this time by the older guard who had been waiting outside, slid home with its familiar, dull thud. Chio sat on her cot, her heart pounding. Her mind was reeling. She had been wrong. The Marine was not the true face. Lieutenant Davis was not the true face. They both were. The enemy was not a single entity. It was a contradiction. It was a nation that produced soldiers who hated them enough to call them animals, and also produced nurses who would defend them, not out of kindness, but out of a cold, fierce adherence to rules. She touched her uniform. She felt the harness beneath it. The brassiere. It was not a lie. It was part of the rules. It was the same bureaucratic impulse that had just protected her. The confrontation with the young Marine and Lieutenant Davis's icy defense of protocol left Chio in a state of profound imbalance. The barracks, which had been a simple cage, now felt like a complex social laboratory. She found herself oscillating between the fear of the Marine's naked hatred and a bewildering respect for the lieutenant's rigid adherence to rules. Life, however, was reduced to basic needs. And after a week in the oppressive tropical humidity, one need became paramount. Laundry. Their single set of undergarments was stiff with sweat and grime. The HBT uniforms were heavy and sour. The feeling of being unclean was a constant, itchy humiliation, almost as bad as the fear. Chio, as the ranking nurse, knew she had to act. During the next delivery by the quiet older guard, she held up her soiled undergarments, mimicking the motion of scrubbing. "Wash," she said, using one of the few words she'd learned. "Soap. Wash." The guard looked at the garments, then at her, his expression unchanged. He nodded once, locked them in, and left. An hour later, he returned. He did not unlock the door, but opened a small slot at the bottom. He pushed through 3 bars of pale yellow, unscented laundry soap, and a bucket. He pointed down the corridor. "1 hour, one at a time." He was speaking to her. Chio pointed to herself, then to Akiko. "2?" The guard sighed, a long, weary sound. "2. Stay together. 10 minutes." He gestured again, miming, "Come here." He unlocked the door and escorted Chio and Akiko down the short, dim hallway to a separate utility lawn. It was just a concrete basin with a single cold water tap and a drain. He pointed. 10 minutes. He stood by the door, his rifle resting against his shoulder, pointedly looking at the wall. They were not prisoners. They were a chore. Akiko began to scrub her HBT uniform vigorously, grateful for the soap and water. But Chio hesitated. She held the brassiere in her hands. This was the source of her anxiety. How did one wash such a complex thing? The sriracha was simple. It could be boiled, beaten against a rock, scrubbed mercilessly, and it would only become softer, whiter. But this American object was different. It had elastic. She knew from her limited medical knowledge that intense heat or harsh scrubbing would ruin the rubber threads, making the straps sag and lose their vital tension. And the metal hooks, would they rust? She looked at the yellow bar of soap. It was cruder than the lye soap from the showers, smelling only of basic tallow. She was terrified of destroying the garment. To lose it would be to revert, to go back to the shapeless rags and bindings of capture. This harness, as she thought of it, had become a strange, secret piece of armor. Its structure imposed order on the chaos. "Chio-san?" Akiko asked, noticing her hesitation. Chio shook her head and began to wash delicately. She worked the soap into a lather in her hands and gently pressed it into the cotton cups, avoiding the elastic straps as much as possible. She scrubbed the band but avoided the metal hooks, rinsing it quickly under the weak stream of cold water. It was a poor job, but she dared not risk more. She was squeezing the water from the garment when she looked up, past Akiko, through the lawn's only opening a square, screen-covered window. The window looked out onto a service yard, and in that yard was a clothesline. It was not a prisoner's line. It was strung between the American nurses' quarters and a utility pole. The tropical sun beat down on it, and a dozen or more olive-drab uniforms hung stiffly, identical to her own. But it was not the uniforms that held her gaze. It was the line next to them. It was a line of women's underthings. And hanging in a neat, orderly row were 4, 5, 6 white brassieres. Chio froze. Her hands, still holding her own wet garment, dropped to her sides. She stared. They were identical to hers. They had the same structured cups, the same thick shoulder straps, the same band. One of them, hanging at the end, was larger, more formidable. Chio recognized, with a jolt, the severe, no-nonsense shape of the one she imagined must belong to Lieutenant Davis. Her mind, which had been racing with contradictions, suddenly stalled. Her entire theory collapsed. She had believed this garment was a special kind of prisoner issue, perhaps something substandard, something designed to humiliate, or, in her more recent theory, a bureaucratic line item, like a boot or a mess kit. But she was wrong. The American nurses wore the exact same thing. The brassiere was not a prisoner item. It was not a special item at all. It was just the standard. The implication of that was staggering. It meant that in the American system, the baseline of acceptable dignity for a woman, even a captured enemy woman, was the same as that for their own decorated nurses. It was not kindness. It was not cruelty. It was an expression of a standardized, industrialized, and completely impersonal system of human maintenance. They were processing women, and this is what women required. The thought was so vast, so alien to her own cultural understanding of scarcity and hierarchy, that she could barely grasp it. "Chio-san, we must go," Akiko whispered, nervously eyeing the guard. Chio blinked, pulling her gaze away from the window. She looked down at the wet, cleanish brassiere in her hand. It was no longer a symbol of her captivity or a tool of the enemy. It was, simply, a bra. Just like theirs. She carefully folded it and placed it, along with her other items, into the bucket. They returned to the barracks, the guard locking the door behind them. The other women looked at her, eager for their turn. Chio went to her cot. She did not hang the garment in the dim, humid air of the barracks. Instead, she laid it flat on her thin mattress, carefully shaping the cups, smoothing the straps, and placing the metal hooks so they would not rust against the fabric. She would let it dry slowly, properly. It was, she now understood, a valuable piece of equipment. The revelation at the clothesline settled into Chio's mind, not as a comfort, but as a stabilizing ballast. The world was still insane, but it was an organized insanity. The Americans were not driven by chaotic malice, but by a vast, industrial logic she was just beginning to perceive. The brassiere was no longer a harness of shame. It was a piece of standard issue equipment. This new understanding, however, did nothing to combat the realities of the barracks. The greatest enemy was no longer the guards, but the environment itself, the suffocating humidity, the relentless mosquitoes, and the poor diet. In the third week, Akiko fell ill. It began as a listlessness, a refusal of the canned rations. Then came the shivering, despite the oppressive heat. By nightfall, she was burning with fever. Chio was stripped of her identity. She was a nurse with no tools. She had no thermometer, no medicine, not even a clean cloth for a compress. She could only sit by Akiko's cot, feeling the girl's pulse race beneath her fingertips, her skin radiating a dry, dangerous heat. Akiko's breathing was shallow, and she drifted into a state of restless delirium, murmuring for her mother in Osaka. All of Chio's training, her years of service, were useless. She was reduced to a helpless observer. The frustration was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, sharper than hunger. She knew Akiko needed two things: hydration and aspirin. The chlorinated water in their canteen was warm and tasted of metal, and Akiko spat it out. She needed Asa aspirin to break the fever. Chio waited by the door, pacing the length of the small barracks, her hands clenched. She felt the rough HBT fabric of her uniform, and beneath it, the familiar, structured presence of the brassiere, a reminder of the order she could not access. When the bolt finally scraped back for the morning ration delivery, Chio was ready. It was the quiet older guard. He started to push the crate in. Chio stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Nani?" he grunted, surprised by her boldness. Chiyo pointed frantically at Akiko, who was shivering violently on the cot. "Sick," Chiyo said, tapping her own forehead and mimicking a shiver. "Hot. Sick." The guard stared at her. His face was a blank mask of incomprehension. He thought she was complaining. He shrugged, as if to say, "What do you want me to do?" "Medicine," Chiyo pleaded. Desperate. She mimed, swallowing a pill, and pointed to her head. The guard frowned, his patience thinning. He shook his head. "No. Rations. Eat." He pushed the crate again, harder this time. "No, please." Chiyo held her ground. She pointed again at Akiko, her voice rising in desperation. "Sick. Water. Medicine." The guard raised his hand, gesturing for her to get back. He was becoming agitated. This was a breach of protocol. Chiyo knew she was risking punishment, a day without food, or worse, but the sight of Akiko, small and dying on the cot, erased her fear. "What in God's name is going on here, Corporal?" The voice was sharp, female, and instantly recognizable. Lieutenant Davis stood in the corridor, her clipboard in hand, her face etched with impatience. The corporal stiffened, immediately stepping back. "Ma'am," the guard said, relieved. "This one. I don't know." Agitated, Lieutenant Davis peered into the dim barracks, her eyes landing on Chiyo, then on the trembling form on the cot. She looked annoyed, as if this display was another inconvenient stain on her morning schedule. "What is it, prisoner?" Davis asked, her voice flat. Chiyo's mind raced. She had no words. Mime had failed. She looked at the lieutenant, at the crisp uniform, the symbol of authority and rules. And then, inspiration, born of pure desperation, struck. Chiyo stopped miming. She stood straight. She pointed a single, steady finger directly at the small, dark insignia pinned above the lieutenant's breast pocket. "Nurse," Chiyo said, her voice clear and strong. Davis paused, her eyebrows raising slightly. "That's right. I'm a nurse. Now what is the problem?" Then, Chiyo brought her hand to her own chest, pointing at herself. "Nurse?" she repeated. The word hung in the humid air between them. It was a statement. A bridge. The impatience on Lieutenant Davis's face dissolved. It was replaced by something else, a flicker of comprehension, sharp and sudden. The hierarchy of guard and prisoner vanished, replaced by an older, more fundamental one. She looked at Chiyo, truly saw her, for the first time. Then she looked past her, at the cot. "Show me," Davis said. Chiyo stepped aside. Lieutenant Davis entered the barracks, a place she had never set foot in before. The other women shrank back, but Chiyo stood her ground. Davis strode to Akiko's cot. She did not hesitate. She placed the back of her hand on Akiko's forehead, her movements identical to those Chiyo had performed 100 times. She felt her pulse, then lifted one of the girl's eyelids to check her pupils. "Fever," Davis stated. "Dehydrated." She looked at Chiyo. "How long?" Chiyo held up one finger. "1 day." "Night," Davis nodded curtly. The professional assessment was complete. She turned and left the barracks without another word. Chiyo waited, her heart hammering. The guard stood awkwardly by the door, confused by the sudden shift in command. 5 minutes later, Lieutenant Davis returned. She was carrying her own metal medical kit. She handed Chiyo a small tin of aspirin Bayer, the name stamped on the lid, and 2 chlorine purification tablets. Then she handed her her own personal canteen. "This water is clean," Davis said. "Use it. 1 aspirin now, 1 in 4 hours. Use the tablets for the rest of your water." Chiyo stared at the items in her hand. The silver tin. The canteen. She looked up at the American nurse. She did not know the words. She bowed, deeply, from the waist. A formal, Japanese bow of profound gratitude. When she rose, Lieutenant Davis was already turning to leave. "See that she drinks, nurse," she said, and was gone. Chiyo did not hesitate. She administered the pill, forcing Akiko to drink the cool, clean water from the American canteen. By evening, Akiko's fever had broken. She was weak, but lucid, and asked for food. The next morning, when the old guard came, Chio was waiting. She handed him the empty canteen. When he returned it, filled, she looked him in the eye and said a word she had practiced all night, reading it from the aspirin tin. "Thank you." The guard just grunted. She then held up the empty wrapper from the laundry soap. "Soap?" she asked, testing the new power of language. The guard sighed, reached into his pocket, and tossed her a new bar. Chio had found the key. It was not kindness. It was communication. The 14th of January, 1946. US. Naval Base. Guam. 6 weeks had passed since the day Akiko's fever broke. 6 weeks that felt like 6 years. The war had officially ended, the news filtering into their barracks not through an announcement, but through a subtle shift in the camp's atmosphere. The urgency evaporated, replaced by a vast, listless boredom. Then came the transfer. They were herded onto a stiflingly hot transport ship, their fears ignited all over again, only to be deposited here, on Guam. This new camp was different from the temporary processing center on Peleliu. That had been a place of raw survival, canvas and mud. This was a place of permanence. It had paved roads, multi-story wooden barracks, and mess halls that served thousands. It was a city dedicated to processing the remnants of the war. And with a new camp came new rules, new guards, and a new, chilling sense of anonymity. They were no longer 7 women in a locked room. They were 7 women among hundreds of other prisoners, Korean laborers, Okinawan civilians, and other Japanese nurses all waiting. The sound came first. The crunch of heavy boots on the coral pathway, sharp in the pre-dawn chill. "Roll call. On the line." Chio instinctively pulled Akiko closer, shielding the younger nurse's trembling shoulders with her own body. The pre-dawn ritual was still new, still terrifying. In the dark, it was easy to imagine this was the end. A final march. "They are early today," Akiko whispered in Japanese, her voice tight with panic. "Are they taking us somewhere else? To a different camp?" "Hush," Chio said. "It is just the count. But the guards are different. I don't see the old man." "It doesn't matter. Stand straight." Chio's voice was calm, but her heart hammered. Akiko was right. The routine was slightly different, and in their precarious world, any change was a threat. They stood in formation, just as they had been taught in Osaka. But everything else was wrong. The air was cold, heavy with the salt spray from the nearby ocean. The smells of lye soap and damp canvas still clung to them from the laundry lines. A painted sign near the mess tent door read, "Maintain orderly line." Await. Instructions. A rule for everything. She felt the now familiar structure beneath her uniform, the brassiere. After 6 weeks, it was no longer a foreign object. It was part of her. Its daily presence was a ritual in itself. Putting it on in the morning was the first act of order in a chaotic day. Its elastic straps were worn, the cotton softened from many careful washings. The metal hooks, which she dried meticulously, were still bright. It was no longer a symbol of her enemy's industrial might, or a harness of shame. It had become something simpler. Her armor. It was the barrier between her body and the rough HBT uniform. A small, private piece of structure that belonged to her. It was the first thing she had been given that asserted her humanity, and she clung to it. A jeep pulled up, its headlights cutting through the gloom. A figure stepped out, and Chio's breath caught. It was Lieutenant Davis. She had not seen the American nurse since leaving Peleliu. She looked the same. Crisp. Severe. Her clipboard held like a shield. She was clearly in charge of this new section as well. Davis walked to the front of the formation, her gaze sweeping over the women. She was flanked by 2 new, armed Marines. "Is this it, Lieutenant?" one of the Marines asked. "This is the contingent from Peleliu. 7 nurses," Davis replied, her voice cutting the tension. She began to read names from her list, names that were not their own, but Americanized approximations. Akiko, Akiko flinched. Chiyo nudged her. "Hi," Akiko whispered. "Chiyo?" "Here," Chiyo said, the English word feeling firm on her tongue. Davis ticked the name off her list. She finished the count. All present. She looked at the women. Her expression was, as always, unreadable. But Chiyo sensed the same weary impatience, the same drive to maintain order. "It's just roll call, ladies," Lieutenant Davis announced, her voice louder now, for all to hear. "Stand easy." Chiyo felt Akiko relax beside her. She let out a small, shuddering breath. Chiyo looked at the American nurse. Davis was already turning away, speaking to the Marines, handing one of them the clipboard. The ritual was complete. The system was in place. This strange new life, defined by confusing rituals, by objects like the brassiere, by rules that both imprisoned and protected, was continuing. "Akiko," Chiyo whispered, as the dawn light began to turn the gray sky to a pale, bruised purple. "What is it?" "It is all right," Chiyo said, repeating the English words she had heard Davis use. "Stand easy. It is just the count." She watched the lieutenant walk back to her jeep, a small, rigid figure of authority in a vast, incomprehensible machine. For the first time, Chiyo did not feel fear. She did not feel hatred. She felt a strange, cold clarity. She understood the rules, and as long as she understood the rules, she could survive. The rumors began to circulate in the third week of January. They were whispers at first, carried on the wind from the men's compounds, then confirmed by a subtle shift in the guards' behavior. They were no longer just maintaining prisoners. They were processing them. Then, the lists were posted. Chiyo's name was on the third transport, scheduled to depart for Uraga. The news did not bring the elation she had expected. The word home had become a phantom, a place she remembered in flashes of cherry blossoms and the scent of her mother's kitchen, but which now felt distant and threatening. Akiko was the first to voice the fear that haunted them all. "Chiyo-san," she whispered, her hands twisting in the fabric of her HBT trousers. "What? What will they say when we return?" Chiyo had no answer. She knew what they would say. They were not heroes. They were not even survivors. They were failures. They were women who had been captured, who had lived, who had eaten the enemy's food and worn the enemy's clothes. They were, in the eyes of their homeland, unclean. The propaganda that had once terrified her of the Americans now terrified her of her own people. She had failed to die. The fear was a cold, hard stone in her gut. She had survived the Americans, their chemicals, their rules, their confusing logic. She was not sure she would survive the peace. On the day of departure, they were marched from the barracks one last time. The sun was rising over the harbor, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. A massive gray transport ship waited, its cargo nets already full of soldiers. The process was, like everything else, an exercise in bureaucracy. They were lined up, their names checked off a list, and pointed toward the gangplank. The air smelled of salt, diesel fuel, and the metallic scent of the ship itself. Chiyo clutched the small bundle that contained her only possessions, a bar of soap and the worn familiar brassiere, which she had washed and folded the night before. She had chosen not to wear it for the journey home, fearing it would be found that it would be the final proof of her contamination. It felt safer to revert to the familiar, tight binding of a sarashi she had fashioned from a torn bedsheet. "Chiyo." The voice was not Japanese. It was American, and sharp. Chiyo turned. Lieutenant Davis was standing 10 feet away, near a stack of crates, her clipboard noticeably absent. She was off duty, yet she still wore the same expression of impatient efficiency. Chiyo instinctively tensed. Was there a problem? A last-minute change? "Come here," Davis ordered. Chiyo hesitated, then stepped out of the line. The other women watched, their faces pale with fear. Akiko looked like she was about to weep. Chiyo stood before the American nurse. She was close enough to see the small freckles on the bridge of Davis's nose, the exhaustion in her blue eyes. The lieutenant looked just as tired as she felt. "You are on this transport?" Davis asked. Chio nodded. Yes, to Uraga. Davis stared at her for a long moment, the sounds of the busy harbor swirling around them. It was the first time they had ever spoken without a clear, defined purpose. A fever, a roll call, a breach of protocol. Then, Davis reached into the pocket of her own fatigue jacket. She pulled out a small, neat package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple string. She pushed it into Chio's hands. It was small, light, but firm. Chio looked at the package, then at Davis, her expression one of utter confusion. For the trip, Davis said, her voice gruff, as if she were embarrassed. It is regulation. All female repatriates are to be issued new supplies. Chio knew, instinctively, that this was a lie. There was no regulation. This was not on a list. This was a personal act, disguised as bureaucracy. Her fingers, stiff and cold in the morning air, fumbled with the string. It fell away. She unfolded the brown paper. Inside was a brassiere. It was not like the one she had folded in her bundle, which was now grayed and softened with wear. This one was new. It was brilliant white, the cotton stiff, the elastic straps vibrant and strong. A small cardboard tag was still attached, printed with the words, "Made in USA." Chio lifted it. It was her size, 34. The size Davis had measured on that first terrifying day in the delousing lawn. The lieutenant had remembered. She stared at the object. This impossible, perfect piece of American engineering. It was the entire story, all at once. It was the industrial might that could produce such things in endless quantity. It was the cold, clinical system that measured a prisoner. It was the adherence to rules that had saved Akiko's life. And now, it was this an act of strange, impersonal kindness from one nurse to another. It was the ultimate expression of soft power. It was not a weapon, nor a pamphlet. It was a piece of underwear, and it had changed her world. Chio, come! The line was moving. Chio looked up from the gift, her eyes blurring. She looked at Lieutenant Davis. She did not know the words to express the galaxy of emotion she felt. Thank you was too small. Why was too large. So she did the only thing that made sense. She held the new brassiere in one hand, and with the other, she placed her palm on her own chest. Nurse, she said. Then, she bowed. It was not the bow of a prisoner to a guard. It was not the bow of the defeated to the victor. It was the deep, respectful bow of a professional. It was the bow of Chio, the nurse from Osaka, to Lieutenant Davis, the nurse from Ohio. When she straightened, Davis's expression had not changed, but she gave a single, short nod, an acknowledgement. Go on, Davis said, turning away. You'll miss your boat. Chio turned and ran to catch up with Akiko, the new brassiere clutched tightly in her hand. She did not look back. As she stepped onto the gangplank, she felt the rough fibers of her makeshift sarashi chafing her skin. When she was safe on the ship, she thought, she would find a private place. She would take off the binding of her past and put on the armor of her future.